That sizzling breakfast sausage patty you just flipped in the pan this morning. The one that filled your entire kitchen with that familiar smell while you rushed to get everyone out the door. The one you fed your kids because the box said 100% pork or golden brown and delicious, or made with real meat right there on the front panel in bold, confident letters. You assumed that meant something simple and honest. Meat, salt, pepper, sage, maybe a little water to help everything bind together. That is what breakfast sausage has been for as long as anyone alive can actually remember. That is the entire recipe farmers, butchers, and home cooks have relied on for generations. Long before any of these packages ever existed, most of what is sitting inside your grocery store's refrigerated case and frozen aisle right now is not that. It is a processed meat product engineered from the ground up to look perfectly uniform, cook quickly and predictably, freeze rock hard, and survive weeks or even months in cold storage without ever changing shape, color, or texture. All of it held together with fillers, extenders, phosphates, and preservatives that most people would never guess are legally allowed to sit inside something proudly labeled as sausage. We pulled the ingredient labels off 11 of the biggest breakfast sausage brands sold across America. The one sitting in nearly every grocery store freezer case from coast to coast. Reread every single line printed on every single package. No skimming past the fine print. No assuming based on the farmhouse imagery splashed across the front. Some of what we found is completely legal and completely standard practice for industrial meat processing in this country. Some of it is restricted, watched closely, or avoided entirely in other parts of the world that regulate processed meat differently than the United States does. And by the time we get all the way through this list, you are going to look at that sausage box currently sitting in your freezer in a completely different way than you did this morning. We are counting down from the least concerning entry all the way to the most concerning. And at the very end, I am going to hand you 5 brands that are actually doing this the right way, including one option you can make yourself in your own kitchen tonight for a fraction of the cost. Let's get into it. Number 11. Jimmy Dean Original Pork Sausage. Jimmy Dean is the name most Americans think of first the instant they hear the words breakfast sausage. The folksy logo, the farmer mascot leaning against a fence post, decades of television commercials built around warm family breakfast tables and lazy Sunday mornings. This is the brand that basically defined the entire category for 2 full generations of shoppers standing in the meat aisle without ever once questioning what was actually inside the roll. Flip the package over and read the ingredient list slowly. Pork water and then a list of seasonings, followed by dextrose and then BHA and BHT listed together, both of which are synthetic preservatives, specifically used to prevent the fat inside the sausage from turning rancid during long-term frozen storage that can stretch on for months at a distribution center before the product ever reaches your store. BHA in particular has been classified by some international health bodies as a substance reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen based on animal studies conducted over the years, though regulators here in the United States still consider current usage levels within an acceptable safety margin for regular consumption. It remains completely legal at the levels used in this product. It is restricted or banned outright in several other countries that have taken a more cautious regulatory stance. Jimmy Dean is not doing anything illegal here, and to its credit, the pork content itself is genuinely listed as the primary ingredient, which already puts this brand ahead of several others further down this list. But the preservative package quietly tucked into a product carrying this much-inherited brand trust is worth actually knowing about before it lands on your kid's breakfast plate every single week without you ever having flipped the box around to check. Number 10. Bob Evans Original Sausage Roll. Bob Evans built its entire identity around a farmhouse aesthetic, the actual sit-down restaurant chain with the wraparound porches and rocking chairs out front. The overall sense that this brand is genuinely closer to a home-style Ohio farm kitchen than anything coming out of a massive industrial meat processing plant. That farmhouse feeling is the entire reason people instinctively reach for this red package over a plainer-looking store brand sitting one shelf down at a lower price. The ingredient list here does hold up reasonably well when compared against some of the brands we will get to further down this countdown. Pork, water, salt, spices, and a noticeably shorter list of additives than several of its direct competitors. But look closely at the sodium content listed per serving, which comes in surprisingly high, often exceeding a full quarter of a day's recommended sodium intake in just 2 links or 1 small patty by itself. And the fat content sits well above what a genuinely lean cut of pork shoulder would naturally deliver on its own. A fairly strong signal that fat trim and connective tissue are being blended in at a higher ratio than an actual butcher would ever use if they were grinding fresh sausage right there in front of you at a counter. The farmhouse image printed across the package is real, effective marketing. The nutritional mat sitting quietly inside the package is the part nobody ever puts on a billboard along the highway. Number 9. Johnsonville Original Breakfast Sausage. Johnsonville has spent years carefully positioning itself as the premium option sitting in the sausage aisle, the brand people reach for at every summer cookout, the one carrying slightly higher price tags that signal, at least on the surface, a genuine step up in quality over the mass-market competitors sitting right next to it on the same shelf. The ingredient list includes pork water salt and a specific stabilizing compound called sodium phosphate, which is used industrially to help the sausage retain more moisture during the cooking process so it does not shrink and dry out as dramatically once it hits a hot grill or pan. Sodium phosphate is FDA approved and genuinely widespread across the processed food industry. But nutrition researchers have flagged repeatedly that Americans on average are already consuming phosphate additives at levels well beyond any actual dietary need, largely because these additives show up across dozens of different processed foods simultaneously throughout a normal week of eating, not just inside one single product sitting in your freezer. For people managing kidney function or anyone on a phosphate-restricted diet for medical reasons, that additive load adds up remarkably fast across a normal week, often without anyone realizing exactly where all of it is quietly coming from in the first place. You are paying a genuine premium price here at checkout, but a meaningful part of what you are actually paying for is moisture retention engineering, not necessarily a meaningfully better cut of raw pork underneath the marketing. Number 8. Great Value Breakfast Sausage. Walmart's house brand sold in nearly every one of their locations nationwide. This is the sausage that fills grocery carts specifically because it is cheap, familiar, and reliably in stock no matter which Walmart location you happen to walk into anywhere across the entire country. Before you even bother opening the package, check the ingredient statement closely for the phrase mechanically separated chicken or mechanically separated turkey, quietly blended into what is marketed on the front as a pork product. Mechanically separated meat is produced industrially by forcing bones with attached tissue through high-pressure sieves under significant force, producing a paste-like substance that then gets blended into the final product as a cost-saving filler that stretches the actual pork content further. It is completely legal, it is inspected by regulators, and it is disclosed on the label if it happens to be present. But it is a fundamentally different raw material than the whole muscle cuts most people naturally picture in their head when they see the word sausage printed on a package at the store. Walmart generated well over $600 billion in total revenue last year alone. Sourcing whole muscle pork exclusively across every single product line is not remotely a financial constraint for a company operating at that kind of scale. It is a deliberate margin decision made batch after batch after batch, because the price point has to stay low enough to keep the cart moving smoothly through checkout without a single shopper ever pausing to ask a second question about what they just placed inside it. Number 7. Owens Breakfast Sausage Roll. Owens has built a genuinely loyal Southern customer base over the course of several decades, sold heavily across grocery chains throughout the South and the Midwest. Often positioned directly next to Bob Evans on the shelf as the other traditional option for families making biscuits and gravy together on a slow weekend morning. The ingredient list includes pork water salt spices, and depending on the specific variety, you pick up a small percentage of what the label simply lists as flavoring, a vague catch-all term that discloses absolutely nothing specific about what is actually blended into that seasoning base behind closed doors. More notably, several Owens varieties include added sugar in the form of dextrose at a meaningfully higher percentage than the plain varieties offered by competing brands, part of a broader industry-wide trend toward slightly sweetening savory processed meat products, specifically to make them more palatable, more craveable, and more likely to drive repeat purchases week after week. It is a small detail that is genuinely easy to miss on a label already crowded with a dozen other ingredients competing for your attention. But it adds up the same quiet way it does in bread, in cereal, and in nearly every other processed food category where sugar has slowly crept into products that were never traditionally sweet to begin with. Number 6. Tennessee Pride Breakfast Sausage. Tennessee Pride markets itself heavily around heritage and tradition, leaning hard into old-fashioned recipe language and a folksy regional identity built specifically to feel like it comes from a smaller, more traditional family operation rather than one of the national industrial brands surrounding it on the same shelf. Tennessee Pride is actually owned by the same larger parent company behind several other major processed meat brands you would recognize instantly, and the supply chain behind it reflects that same larger industrial scale rather than anything even remotely resembling a small regional operation working out of one facility. The ingredient list includes pork, water, salt, spices, BHA, BHT, and citric acid used both as a preservative and as a pH stabilizer to help maintain consistent flavor and texture across enormous production batches. The heritage branding printed across the package and the actual industrial sourcing happening quietly behind it are two completely separate stories. And the label itself is designed specifically so you never notice the gap between the two, while you are standing there in the meat aisle deciding what goes into your cart for the week. Number 5. Farmland breakfast sausage. Farmland leans directly and heavily into agricultural imagery, rolling green pastures printed across nearly every inch of the packaging. A brand name that sounds like it genuinely belongs to a single working farm somewhere, rather than a large-scale meat processing corporation operating multiple facilities spread across several different states simultaneously. The ingredient list includes pork, water, salt, spices, sodium nitrite and several of its varieties, and BHA together with BHT listed as preservatives. Sodium nitrite itself is used extensively across the entire processed meat industry to prevent dangerous bacterial growth and to help preserve that familiar pink color consumers associate with fresh meat, and it is generally recognized as safe within properly regulated amounts. But when sodium nitrite interacts with proteins during high-heat cooking, it can form compounds called nitrosamines, and peer-reviewed research has associated elevated nitrosamine exposure with increased cancer risk in the specific context of regular, long-term consumption of processed meat over many years. Regulators have not banned sodium nitrite outright because the food safety benefit of reliably preventing bacterial contamination is generally considered to outweigh the documented long-term risk at approved usage levels, but the underlying trade-off is real and well documented, and it is one almost nobody standing there admiring Farmland's pastoral packaging is actually thinking about while flipping a patty into a hot pan on a Tuesday morning. Number 4. Butterball breakfast turkey sausage. Butterball built its entire reputation over decades around Thanksgiving turkey specifically, and it leveraged that deep seasonal trust directly into the everyday breakfast sausage category, marketed heavily toward health-conscious shoppers actively looking for something they perceive as leaner and cleaner than traditional pork sausage sitting one shelf over. Here is the part that genuinely surprises most people once they actually look into it. Turkey sausage is not automatically healthier simply because it swaps out the base protein source. To compensate for turkey's naturally leaner profile and to replicate the mouthfeel and juiciness people already expect from traditional pork sausage manufacturers, frequently add extra vegetable oil, extra sodium, and binding agents like modified food starch specifically to help hold the patty together properly during cooking without falling apart in the pan. Butterball's own ingredient list reflects exactly that pattern, with added vegetable oil listed clearly and a sodium content per serving that in several of their most popular varieties actually matches or slightly exceeds standard pork sausage from several competing brands sitting nearby on the same shelf. You reached for the turkey version specifically because it felt like the more responsible, health-conscious choice standing there in front of that meat case. In several documented cases, you are not actually reducing your sodium or fat intake in any meaningful way at all, just quietly switching which animal it originally came from. Number 3. Swift Premium Breakfast Sausage. Swift is one of the oldest and most historically significant names in American meat processing, and over the decades it has largely settled into a value-tier brand distributed heavily through discount grocery chains and regional retailers, rather than premium supermarkets chasing a health-conscious customer base. The ingredient list here includes pork, water, salt, spices, mechanically separated pork and several of its varieties, sodium phosphate and BHA together with BHT, all appearing in the same single product, effectively stacking multiple additive categories that appeared individually across several higher-ranked brands earlier on this list into one combined package. At the price point Swift typically sells it across discount retailers. The formulation choices reflect exactly what you would reasonably expect given that pricing pressure. Maximum shelf stability, maximum cost efficiency, minimum whole muscle content relative to fillers, all carefully engineered to hit a price point low enough to move genuine volume through discount retail channels every single week, without leaving much room left in the margin for a cleaner, more expensive formulation. If you have made it this far into the list, you have probably already started mentally walking over to your own freezer to check what brand is actually sitting in there right now. Subscribe to the Hidden Receipt right now because we do exactly this every single week, pulling ingredient labels apart brand by brand so that you never have to stand there yourself in a cold grocery aisle squinting at fine print while other shoppers wait behind you with their carts. We have 3 more entries left to get through, and the very next one might genuinely surprise you if it is currently sitting in your own freezer at home right now. Number 2. Store brand and unbranded frozen breakfast sausage links and patties sold across regional grocery chains all over the country. This is really more of an entire category than a single name brand. The plain white and blue packaging sitting quietly on the bottom shelf of the freezer case. Price it low enough that it barely even registers as a distinct line item on your total grocery bill at checkout. These products are almost always built around the cheapest legally permissible formulation the entire category allows under current regulations. Mechanically separated meat high-fat trim used instead of whole muscle cuts, added water bound in tightly with phosphates, and modified starches specifically to increase overall yield per pound of raw protein originally purchased. And the maximum preservative load the category permits in order to maximize freezer shelf life across a distribution network that can genuinely take months to fully sell through before a package even reaches your local store. There is no brand reputation on the line here at all, which means there is very little remaining financial incentive to spend money improving the formula beyond the bare legal minimum required to keep the product technically compliant and sitting on shelves. Number 1. Ultra discount frozen sausage multi-packs sold at dollar stores and the deepest discount shelves of regional grocery chains nationwide. The absolute bottom of the entire category, and it genuinely is not particularly close to anything else on this list. Large bags of frozen patties or links sold at a price so low per pound that it honestly raises a fair question about how any meaningful percentage of actual whole muscle pork could possibly be included at that specific cost point. At that rock-bottom price point, there is essentially no room left in the margin for whole cuts, proper seasoning, or any semblance of a clean, recognizable ingredient list. These products are typically built from the cheapest available combination of mechanically separated meat fat trim-textured vegetable protein used as a cheap filler and binder added water, and the absolute maximum preservative load the category legally allows under current food safety regulations. There is no brand reputation here to protect, and no ongoing customer relationship to maintain beyond the single anonymous transaction happening at the register that day, when there is nothing meaningfully at stake for the company selling it. There is very little remaining reason to spend even 1 extra cent on the actual meat quietly sitting inside that bag. That is the full list. 11 brands, 1 single pattern repeating itself over and over again from the very top of this countdown all the way down to the bottom. Mechanically separated meat and fat trim consistently standing in for whole muscle cuts a real butcher would use. Phosphates and starches standing in for real moisture retention achieved through proper technique and patient cooking. BHA, BHT, and heavy preservative loads standing in for a shorter, more honestly priced shelf life that most of these companies have simply decided, somewhere along the way, that consumers will not tolerate paying more for anymore. Before we get to what is actually worth buying instead, here is something you can go do with the package sitting in your own freezer right now, tonight, without needing a laboratory, a certification, or any special equipment at all. Start with the label test. Flip the package over and actually read every single ingredient listed on it, slowly from top to bottom. A real traditionally made breakfast sausage needs roughly 6 or 7 ingredients at most, no more than that. Pork or another whole muscle meat, salt, black pepper, dried sage, maybe a touch of brown sugar for balance, and perhaps a natural casing if you are looking at links rather than patties. If your ingredient list runs past 10 or 12 separate items and several of those items are chemical-sounding names you would genuinely never find sitting anywhere in your own kitchen spice rack, you are no longer looking at traditional sausage in any meaningful sense of that word. You are looking at a processed meat product that was engineered from the very beginning for a supply chain and a distribution warehouse, not for a person standing at a stove on a Sunday morning. Then run the color and texture test yourself. Real sausage made from genuine whole cuts of pork has visible flecks of fat distributed unevenly throughout the meat when you look closely. and the color running through the interior is a deeper, more naturally variable reddish pink rather than a completely uniform, almost artificial-looking pale pink stretching evenly throughout the entire patty. Cook a single patty and press it gently with the edge of a spatula while it is still in the pan. Real sausage releases a modest, reasonable amount of natural fat and juice as it cooks, and it shrinks somewhat as that moisture naturally cooks out over the heat. If a patty instead releases an unusually large pool of milky white liquid pooling around it in the pan, that is often a telltale sign of added water and phosphates cooking back out of the meat. Water that was never naturally part of the original muscle tissue to begin with before it was processed. Finally, run the ingredient origin test carefully. Look specifically for the exact words mechanically separated appearing anywhere on the label, no matter how small the print is. If you see that phrase, you are not eating whole cuts of meat, regardless of what the front of the package shows you in its glossy photography or its warm farmhouse branding designed to make you feel otherwise. This single phrase, tucked quietly into small print on the back panel where almost nobody ever looks, tells you more about what is actually inside that package than any amount of marketing copy printed proudly across the front of it ever could. Now, 5 brands that are actually doing this the right way, starting with the most widely available and working toward the most involved option of all. The first good pick is Applegate Natural Breakfast Sausage. Applegate has built its entire business model specifically around no antibiotics ever, no added nitrites or nitrates beyond what occurs naturally in the celery powder used for curing, and whole cuts of pork raised without any added growth hormones throughout the entire supply chain. The ingredient list is genuinely short and completely recognizable to anyone reading it. Pork, water, salt, spices, and organic celery powder used specifically as a natural curing agent rather than synthetic sodium nitrite. It costs noticeably more per pound than anything sitting on the avoid list we just walked through together. It absolutely should cost more. You are paying directly for whole muscle pork and a shorter, meaningfully cleaner formulation rather than industrial fillers quietly doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. The second good pick is Pedersen's Natural Farms Breakfast Sausage. This particular brand sources its pork specifically from farms genuinely committed to sustainable, humane raising practices, and the ingredient list reflects that same underlying commitment all the way through the entire processing chain from farm to package. Pork, water, sea salt, and a simple, honest spice blend, with no added sugar in several of their varieties and no synthetic preservatives appearing anywhere on the label at all. Pedersen's has built a smaller but genuinely loyal following specifically among people who read ingredient labels closely and eventually decided that most of the mainstream brands on this list simply were not worth the trade-off anymore once they actually understood what was inside them. The third good pick is Wellshire Farms Breakfast Sausage. Wellshire focuses specifically on products completely free from antibiotics, added hormones, and artificial preservatives of any kind, with an ingredient list built entirely around whole cuts of pork, salt, and traditional seasonings rather than phosphates or mechanically separated filler material. It is widely available at most natural grocery chains and is increasingly showing up now in the natural food section of mainstream supermarkets as consumer demand for genuinely cleaner processed meat options continues to grow steadily year over year across the country. The fourth good pick is Jones Dairy Farm Breakfast Sausage, a family-owned company that has been making sausage the exact same traditional way for well over a century now, without cutting corners, still using whole cuts of pork, natural seasonings, and no added nitrites or artificial preservatives anywhere in their classic line. The texture and flavor difference compared to the mass-market brands sitting on our avoid list is immediately noticeable. The very first time you actually cook a batch side by side, genuinely dense, distinctly meaty, and noticeably less greasy sitting in the pan afterward because there is no added water quietly cooking back out of it during the process. The fifth good pick, and honestly the single most reliable option on this entire list, is simply making your own breakfast sausage at home from scratch. Ground pork shoulder with a reasonable, well-balanced fat ratio, salt, freshly cracked black pepper, dried sage, a small pinch of nutmeg. Add a touch of maple syrup or brown sugar if you personally prefer a slightly sweeter profile in the final patty. Mix everything together gently by hand until it is just barely combined. Form it carefully into individual patties, and either cook it immediately that same day or freeze it in individual portions separated by sheets of parchment paper for easy use later in the month. The total ingredient cost here comes out to a genuinely small fraction of what you would normally pay for a premium package at the grocery store, and you will know with complete and total certainty exactly what went into every single patty that you and your family eat that entire week. Here is the one rule genuinely worth keeping the very next time you find yourself standing in front of the meat case at your local grocery store. Flip the package before it ever goes into your cart. Count the ingredients printed clearly on the back panel. If you cannot honestly picture yourself actually making that exact product at home with what is listed there right in front of you, ask yourself honestly why it needed to be added into the package at all in the first place. If this changed the way you are going to shop for something as everyday and ordinary as breakfast sausage, hit the like button right now before you scroll away to the next video. Tell me down in the comments which one of these 11 brands was sitting in your own freezer before you started watching this. Subscribe to Scam Uncovered so that you catch it every single time we open up another label that nobody else out there is actually bothering to read closely. Stay sharp. Read the back of the package before you ever trust the front of it, and I will see you in the next one.